Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fifth lecture in the series Europe Under Threat, ? Security, Migration and Integration in the IES lecture series. If you haven't seen me before, I was here on the first night, but for those of you who might be new, I'm Peter Burgess. I'm the leader of the security program at the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo, Norway, and a senior fellow at the Institute for European Studies here in Brussels. My co-organizer, Serge Gutwet, whom you've met last time, and the time before probably, is not with us tonight. I have to also extend apologies from my good colleague from Norway, Jorgen, who is ill. Wrote yesterday that he was quite ill and won't be able to make it tonight. So we'll try to let you meet him another time. And I'm very grateful for my other colleague from the IES, Richard Lewis, who has agreed to step in and give a commentary, not a full lecture, but a commentary to Professor Gild's lecture. The title for tonight's lecture was originally Anti-Immigration Strategies in European Immigration Law, but since Jorgen Carling cannot make it, then we're giving free rein to Professor Gild, who will speak on the title Unwanted Migration, Understanding the Relationship Between Economy and Migration, and she'll try to set the stage against the title that was originally planned. A little bit of advertisement for next week. There we have Nicholas Beger from Amnesty International of Europe and Tugba Basaran from the University of Kent, right up the street here. And the theme is Security, Diversity and Human Rights. Professor Gild is Jean-Monnet Professor at persona at Radboud University Nijmegen, in the Netherlands. She's a jurist, also visiting professor at the LSE and the College of Europe in Bruges. She's a specialist in European Union Justice and Home Affairs law and practice, and is a senior research fellow as well at CEPS, the Center for European Policy Studies here in Brussels. She frequently advises both EU institutions and the Council of Europe on migration issues, asylum, and data and privacy matters. Her most recent monograph, do you have a copy? I've got it in my bag. For those of you who have liberty, like I do, to go to seminars all day long, you might have been in a seminar launching today the Professor Gild's book, Security and Migration in the 21st Century at Poverty Press. Mr. Richard Lewis, who will follow, is Senior Research Fellow at the IES, Institute for European Studies, where he concentrates on questions of migration and integration in the European Union. In a career spanning 30 years, at least, in the European Civil Service, he's served in a variety of functions, but most notably in the Directorates General for External Relations and the former Justice, Freedom and Security. He has worked with or done consultative work for a number of international organizations as well: United Nations, Council of Europe, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the International Organization for Migration. Professor Gild will speak for approximately 40 minutes, and then Richard Lewis will give a comment. Tonight, exceptionally, Professor Gild will be leaving at 7:20 to catch a train, and so we'll be closing up by that time, so count on that. So I give the floor with pleasure to Professor Gild.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be addressing you. I see a number of people I know in the audience, and I'm very pleased that you come out this evening for this lecture, this discussion on anti-immigration strategies and EU law. As Peter said, I'm a jurist myself. Let me just keep track of time so that I don't overrun. And I'm always interested in how law interacts with objectives in policy, both at the national and at the supranational level. certain ambiguity in the title which we're thinking about today. And I'm very sorry that my colleague from Norway is not able to be with us. If one thinks about anti-immigration strategies, one presupposes that A, there's a strategy, and that there are at least discussions and concerns which are anti-immigration. And I think one needs to think through a bit what that means to make these assumptions and to assume that there are strategies which are specifically anti-immigration. I think one of the first things one needs to think about in thinking about the question of anti-immigration is to what extent one sees reflected in EU and national law strategies which are indeed anti-immigration. And I think it's quite apparent right across the European Union, and certainly at the EU level, that one has a very, very mixed bag. There are measures which are quite obviously directed against certain types of migration. For instance, one could say that the directive adopted on sanctions on employers for hiring persons who are irregularly present in the EU could be seen as an anti-immigration strategy. On the other hand, about the same time that that directive was adopted, one also has the EU directive on promoting highly qualified migration for the EU, the so-called blue card scheme. So it's difficult to say that there are specific anti-immigration strategies as such. And I want to look at this particularly from the perspective of why is it so difficult to generalize on why there are not anti-immigration strategies. What is it about the field that makes it such a difficult one in terms of any kind of coherence or consistency in respect of the way in which individuals are treated? To do that, I want to look in particular at the question of unwanted migration. Because if one looks at anti-immigration strategies, what one is trying to unpick is what is unwanted immigration, what is wanted immigration, and what is unwanted immigration. And in trying to unravel what is unwanted immigration, one needs to go back to understanding relationships, in particular in respect of ideas about security, about economy, and about migration. And so I'm going to really focus on that intersection in this presentation. Foreigners are often homogenized into categories, notwithstanding their differences. And some of those categories often become associated with threats to security, to the economy, and to communities. The construction of the foreigner as a potential threat then justifies the state in collecting, using, and sharing not only among government departments but with foreign states substantial amounts of personal data about individuals, defining their identities, and questions about who they are. When faced with other states behaving in the same manner towards their own nationals, which have begun to go down this path, the capacity to object is diminished. I want to look at a particular aspect of what Didier Bigot talks of as the insecurity continuum, and that is about economic migration. Among the more common complaints which are heard in Europe about, for instance, asylum seekers, is that they are bogus because in fact they are economic migrants. The structure of this argument presupposes that economic migrants are somehow worse or less deserving than asylum seekers. as even bogus asylum seekers are prefer to pretend to be real asylum seekers than to present themselves as real economic migrants. This shard of apparent common sense, which is prevalent across Europe, rests on another assumption, which is that would-be economic migrants are not needed, unskilled, desperate, and likely to undermine wages and working conditions in the host country. This prejudice then leads to the concern that economic migrants are unable to provide for themselves. They will become a burden on the social system of the state. And thus the foreigner is constructed as a potential threat to collective security expressed in the economic well-being of the state. The foreigner is thus homogenized into one category, and that category is allocated negative characteristics. Then it is for the foreigner to extract him or herself from the category and thus escape from the negative normative allocation. The issue of economic migration is thus cast as one which affects security of the state, the jobs of the economically weak, and the well-being of the state in the form of social assistance and social solidarity. These opinions are often bundled up together and presented under the heading of absorption capacity of the state. To sweeten the argument, which is susceptible to charges of anti-immigrant and often xenophobic rhetoric, one often finds protection of vulnerable immigrant victims of organized crime thrown in as an argument in favor of restrictive policies on economic migration. The European Pact on Immigration and Asylum, adopted in 2008, manages to combine all of these elements in one paragraph, and I quote, "The European Union, however, does not have the resources to decently receive all the migrants hoping to find a better life here. Poorly managed immigration may disrupt the social cohesion of the countries of destination. The organization of immigration must consequently take account of Europe's reception capacity in terms of its labour market, housing and health, education and social services, and protect migrants against possible exploitation by criminal networks." I want to look at this from the perspective of the knowledge which has been created about migrants. What do we know about migrants? And how does this fit or not fit with this image of threat which has been established and is continued in policy documents such as the Pact on Immigration and Asylum? I want to start with the information we have about economic migration and highlight the inconsistencies between the discourse which is promoted by various political actors and the statistics. Then I'll take an example of the complete liberalisation of labour migration among a substantial number of countries. And there I'm talking, of course, about the realisation of free movement of workers in 27 countries which make up the European Union. If I have enough time, I'll look at that in a little bit more depth. But what I want to examine is what we know about economic migration from poor to rich countries, and the inverse, once immigration controls are abandoned, looking both at nationals of EU member states and third country nationals living in the EU. In this context, I'll also address some issues about social benefits and foreigners. Many arguments are made for and against economic migration, though in general there is agreement that some forms of economic migration are beneficial to both developed and developing economies. However, there is much disagreement on what kinds of economic migration are good for which countries. In developed economies, there is general agreement that highly skilled, highly qualified migration is beneficial for growth and innovation, And there you can look at, for instance, the EU's Lisbon strategy for growth and jobs, which reflects this particularly overtly. There is much less of a consensus regarding semi-skilled, low-skilled and unskilled migration. Nonetheless, most developed economies attract semi- and low-skilled migrants, particularly in sectors where, notwithstanding national levels of unemployment, jobs are difficult to fill because of wage levels or social status attached to them. Agriculture, construction, low-end service sectors figure largely in this discussion. In some developing countries, there's a very different approach. The argument of brain drain, that is, the effects of the loss of highly skilled, highly qualified citizens of countries with developing economies to countries with developed economies, arises. The argument goes that the facilitation of highly skilled migration from developing countries to developed ones results in a loss of skills and capacity in the developing economy. The result is to create an obstacle to development. Instead, developing countries often seek agreements with developed countries to facilitate migration of semi-skilled and unskilled workers who are unemployed in their country of origin. Into the mix of conflicting interests, a number of other issues arise. First, there's the question of remittances. To what extent do remittances from migrant workers from developing countries working in developed countries contribute to the welfare of their home state? Secondly, the relationship of education and vocational training possibilities in developed countries for citizens of developing countries becomes woven into debates about economic migration, particularly promoting perspectives of temporary labour migration in order to encourage skills acquisition and export. Much less public discussion takes place around the migration of workers from developed economies to developing ones, though this accounts for a not insignificant number of persons. It includes not only workers in multinational companies who move around the world, often in economic activities related to resource extraction, but also to development and aid workers and workers in social fields going from developed countries to developing countries. The question of security in relation to economic migration arises in a number of other ways. These are primarily based around economic security, the relationship of the state, economy, and workers in promoting the economic well-being of states, and as part of that, the well-being of workers. And some of the key issues there, which we've heard particularly vocally over the last 12 months, is the impact of migrant workers on the labour market. This has two facets. First, in buoyant economies, do migrant workers depress wages? Secondly, in depressed economies, do migrant workers take jobs which would otherwise go to nationals? Migrant workers and access to social benefits. Are migrant workers a threat to social security systems, which are founded on the principle of social solidarity? Thirdly, the impact of foreign investment, the arrival of investors on states' ability to plan economic growth. And fourthly, labour migration as a mechanism to assist development through permitting migrant workers to acquire skills not available in their country of origin and through sending remittances to the country of origin. In order to examine some of these issues, I will first consider what we know about migrant workers and their participation in labour markets. And then I'll look at the policy issues around migrant workers in Europe. On the one hand, the European Commission spends very substantial amounts of money encouraging labour migration within the EU, described as free movement of workers. Labour migration from one member state to another, according to EU law, is characterised as follows, and I quote, "Mobility of labour within the community must be one of the means by which the worker is guaranteed the possibility of improving his living and working conditions and promoting his social advancement while helping to satisfy the requirements of the economies of the member states." That's from Regulation 1612/68 about free movement of workers in the European Union. On the other hand, labour migration from outside the EU is framed in a very different way. As the Council stated in 2006, the objective of EU labour migration policy from outside the EU is, and I quote, to develop, as far as legal migration is concerned, well-managed migration policies fully respecting national competencies to assist Member States to meet existing and future labour needs. The focus is on a state-centric approach where states manage migration, the objectives of individuals to move or not, as expressed in the EU free movement of workers, is most noticeable by its complete absence. So what do we know about migrant workers? And here I'm going to look at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development report in 2008 on labour migration. And I'm going to use this because it's the most comprehensive profile on immigrant populations currently available. And the report starts off very interestingly with 12 general findings and a wealth of information about labour migration. The first finding of the study is that by 2000, on average, 7.5% of the total population in OECD countries, and that includes all of the EU, or at least all of the rich EU, was foreign-born, rising to 9% for those persons over 15. Now, some caution needs to be exercised with this figure, as foreign-born is not necessarily foreign nationals, as the report recognises. This can depend on whether or not the state is one where there is large repatriation or expatriate populations, such as France or Portugal in the first category, the UK or Germany in the second. For the OECD, the category immigrant includes national definitions which depend on national rules on permanent residence, as well as foreigners with limited residence permits, or registered on the population register and intending to stay in the host country for longer than a number of months. The question of unemployment among the labour migrant population is important, because this then leads to questions which we're looking at about social solidarity and benefits. And it seems that for labour migrants, unemployment is higher among the highly skilled migrants than it is among nationals. The gap gets greater the higher the skills level. Additionally, immigrants are more likely to be working at jobs beneath their qualification level than nationals. Generally, immigrants are distributed widely across economic sectors, though there are substantial differences in comparison with nationals in various sectors. So, for instance, in agriculture and industry, one finds 33% of workers are nationals, whereas 28.2% on average are immigrants. And one sees a similar kind of distribution across sectors. For instance, in social services, 35% nationals and 39% immigrants. 4 out of every 10 immigrants in the OECD who are over 15 live in the United States, constituting 6.6% of the population. And leaving aside 2 very small states with very high migrant populations, Luxembourg and Switzerland, Germany comes next with 12.1% of its population foreign-born, though there are no figures available on how many of those are German nationals, followed by Austria and Belgium at about 8%, and Australia and Greece at 7%. Mexico is the most important country of origin of immigrants in the OECD, with about 8.4 million, but followed by the United Kingdom and Germany, with about 3 and 2.4 million immigrants elsewhere in the OECD, respectively. And so our image of who is an immigrant begins to change already, with British and German nationals being the second and third most important group of immigrants across the developed world. By contrast, China and India rank 7th and 8th at 2 million immigrants each, so substantially below the UK and Germany. Of the 57 million non-OECD born living in the OECD countries in 2000, they represented 5% of the population then and constitute no more than 1.1% of the population of their countries of origin. Indeed, they account for less than 0.5% of their home populations for India, China, Indonesia, Russia, Nigeria, or Brazil. Now, these are quite different figures we get for some small island states, or for instance for Albania, where 20% of the population are migrant workers elsewhere in the OECD. Again, the OECD sees no evidence of generalized brain drain from developing countries to OECD countries. As regards most large countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, or China, emigration of citizens with tertiary degrees is less than a few percentage points. There are differences, though, for some small Caribbean islands where 40% of their highly skilled population are resident abroad. Interestingly, women with tertiary degrees are more likely to emigrate than their male counterparts. Already, the information we have about immigrants is beginning to confound the image which is expressed in policy documents and in the media. But I'd like to add a few more statistics about what we know about migrants, because I think it's helpful in reconfiguring what we think we know about what unwanted migrants are, what anti-immigrant strategies should be. So let's look just briefly at the information available on immigrants and their educational attainments. For instance, among US immigrants, that's US nationals moving abroad, 20.7% have primary education and 48.5% have tertiary education. This indicates that by and large it's well-educated Americans who emigrate to other OECD countries. However, it's less well known that among Sudanese immigrants, 24.3% have primary education, while 41.4% have tertiary education, a rate very similar to Americans. Further, for Nigerians who move abroad, 16% have primary education and 54.7% have tertiary education, surpassing as a percentage US nationals moving abroad as regards qualifications. If one then turns to British nationals moving abroad, one finds that only 34.7% of them have tertiary education, while 26.9% have primary education. So British immigrants, British nationals moving abroad to work, are less likely to be well qualified than their Nigerian counterparts. Mexican immigration stands out as an exception to that particular finding. Remittances, another issue which I raised at the beginning. What do we know about them? Well, they exceed development aid by a factor of 2 to 1, according to the OECD in 2005. However, among the top 30 countries of origin, based on remittances as percentage of GDP, the top 9 countries where remittances account for percentage in the double digits have very small populations, with one exception, the Philippines. The first on the list is Honduras, where the percentage is 22% of GDP, followed by Lebanon with 22% as well. The Dominican Republic is 10th at 9%. But for most countries with large numbers of citizens working abroad, remittances are not a significant part of GDP. For instance, in both India and Mexico, they account for only 2.8%, and in Nigeria, this drops to 2.3%. What conclusions can we draw from these statistics as regards the issues which I identified at the start of this chapter. The first, as regards the effects of migrant workers on wages. It appears that the better educated they are, the more likely they will be to be excluded from the labour force, i.e. unemployed. This may mean that in developed economies there are well-developed mechanisms which privilege own nationals in highly skilled and paid employment. Statistics on underemployment support such a conclusion, as an important obstacle to highly skilled employment is recognition of qualifications. As regards access to social benefits and unemployment rates of migrants, the unemployment rates of migrants are only marginally higher than those of citizens, even where they have access to benefits paid in the event of unemployment. The difference will be marginal. Therefore, taking the European Union as the example, 39.9% of expenditure on social protection by the 27 member states goes to old age benefits. As the majority of migrants in OECD countries are under 65, they are less likely to be charged to this part of the welfare budget. If we then turn to the European Union, we see an area that was built on the principle of labour migration. The post-Second World War period, the shortage of labour in Europe was dramatic, a result of the destruction wreaked by war and the need to reconstruct whole economies. Many Western European countries, faced with labour shortages such as Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands, entered into bilateral agreements with countries with labour surpluses in the region, such as Italy, Turkey and Morocco, under which agreements workers were recruited. Now, this ended with the oil crisis in 1972 and 73, and the introduction of the idea of zero migration. However, the original member states of the European Union had already entered into the principle of free movement of workers, and therefore their workers could not be subject to these restrictions. There was no possibility to exclude them. As the EU enlarged, it also included the principle of free movement of workers. And thus you have the enlargement first in 1973 with Denmark, Ireland and the UK. No restrictions placed on free movement of workers, though the press in France and the Netherlands in particular indicated fears that their labour markets would be flooded by British workers with no history of minimum wages. Greece joined in 1981. There was a delay in granting free movement of workers, which was lifted in 1986 when Portugal and Spain joined, and their citizens were also subject to a delay until 1991. Austria, Finland and Sweden joined in 1995 with no restriction on free movement of workers, and in 2004 we have the 10 member states joining the European Union with restrictions on free movement of workers for all but the 2 little islands. In 2007 we have the Bulgarian and Romanian accession to the EU with restrictions again. By now, all of the original 15 member states have lifted their restrictions on free movement of workers from the EU 8, that's the 2004 member states, with the exception of Austria and Germany, and the UK is maintaining its worker registration scheme. Now, what does this mean? The gradual opening up of labour markets across the EU to workers from the 2004 and 2007 member states provides an interesting example of the relationship of job security and labour migration. When in 2004, 3 member states, Ireland, Sweden and the UK, were the first to open their labour markets to migrants from these new member states, the discussion was dominated by projections that not many workers would move. In the event, to the UK in particular, with an extremely buoyant economy, about 800,000 workers moved from the period 2004 to 2007. Nonetheless, the UK authorities defended their decision, but they chose not to open their labour markets to Bulgarians or Romanians. This is in contradistinction with Sweden, which opened up its labour market, had very few workers move to Sweden in 2004, but maintained the same position in 2007, opening up its labour market to Bulgarians and Romanians. And after 1 year after enlargement, in fact, there were fewer Bulgarians and Romanians living in Sweden. It went from 3,000 to 2,000 workers over that first year of free movement of workers. In the EU, who moves? Well, Polish nationals are most likely to move from one member state to another, accounting for 25% of intra-EU movement. Next are Romanians at 19%, but in third and fourth place come our Germans and our British nationals. All other nationals constitute much smaller percentages of EU migrant workers. How long do they stay? Well, Irish nationals will stay the longest, along with Portuguese nationals. They stay as a percentage of the working force. They live for more than 4 years in another member state. But only 4% of Romanians will stay for more than 4 years, and it diminishes after that. In terms of designating the question of poverty and wealth and the so-called push factors in respect to migration, what do we know in the European Union where we get rid of the capacity of the state to control labour migration? The European Commission has designated a measure of the risk of poverty, which includes the percentage of the population for whom the equivalized income is below 60% of the median income of the country. The risk of poverty for overall populations ranges from 10 to 12% in the Czech Republic, Denmark, the Netherlands, Slovenia, Slovakia, and Sweden, but rises to 20 to 23%, i.e. it doubles, in Italy, Greece, Latvia, Lithuania, and Spain. Yet Italy's mobility rate is 1.6% of the working population, Greece 3.3, Latvia 1.9, Lithuania slightly higher at 4, and Spain at 0.7. On the other hand, the Netherlands' mobility rate is 1.9 higher than Italy or Spain, and the same as Latvia. The Commission calculates that the income of poor people in the 3 richest EU member states, Austria, the UK, and Luxembourg, is nearly 4 times higher than that of poor people in the 3 poorest states, Latvia, Poland, and Lithuania. What do these statistics mean? They indicate that there is no clear correlation between poverty, either in absolute or comparative terms, and movement of workers. When one takes out of the equation the effectiveness or otherwise of immigration controls, as is the case in the European Union, where there is free movement of persons for economic purposes, the risk of poverty and absolute levels of poverty in countries does not correspond to the levels of movement of workers. People do not move in statistically significant numbers because of poverty. The relationship of poverty and migration is at least in part anecdotal in the EU, and this raises serious questions about its significance as regards migration in the rest of the world. I'll stop there and give Richard a chance to comment on some of those positions. Thank you very much for your attention.
If you don't mind, I can speak from here. Thank you, Elspeth, for a very stimulating talk. You set me a hard task. With all due respect to your oratory skills, I think in many ways it's harder to give off-the-cuff comments from what somebody said than actually to prepare a speech. So maybe I was a bit foolish in undertaking this. Maybe I should have set the lecture instead. However, I have undertaken it, so I will do my best. I think that there are a number of general points that I'd like to make. Somewhat random, but nevertheless, I think relevant. First of all, what we're talking about, either in global terms or in European terms, are relatively small numbers. people who talk about the discourse that talks about being swamped by whoever it is, Romanians or Bulgarians or Nigerians, are talking rubbish. The problem arises when large groups of, fairly large groups of migrants come and settle in limited areas of European cities. Places like Rotterdam or Bradford or Marseille, for example, will talk about the social problems created by migration. And indeed, that is a valid point in those particular cities, in those limited areas. But if you take the overall population of migrants, whether intra-European community or extra-European community, the overall numbers are relatively small. Even the discourse on the Muslim population is relatively misleading. If you hear Geert Wilders talking about it, he talks about 50 million. Well, maybe it is 50 million if you include European Russia and places east of there. But it certainly isn't 50 million by any reasonable estimates. It's only perhaps, maybe 20 million, nobody really knows. So if you look at that, for example, then you realize that that is only, whatever percentage it is, a small percentage of the overall EU population. Similarly with other groups of migrants, they are not necessarily a threat. They may create local social issues, but they are not a threat to the local population or its particular culture in general. That's the first general point I'd like to make. The second is that in many EU countries, the discourse is driven by the media. This is a particular hobby horse of mine, especially coming from Britain, where the screaming headlines of the tabloid newspapers indicate some of the things that Elspeth was talking about. I think there's a large task ahead of us of educating the public in this field, and it's people like you and hopefully us on this side of the table who need to undertake that. It's a very dangerous kind of discourse. It's misleading, inaccurate, and it's not helpful. Then the third general point I'd like to make is one that Elspeth, because I had a chance to look over her book, her very recent book. I mean, the last 2 days it's been published, this afternoon, and so this point is largely taken. She devotes almost one whole chapter to this whole issue, but I think it's worth repeating here. And that is the nature of borders. We have created through the nation state a whole panoply of barriers to migration. That didn't exist 100, 150 years ago. My own grandfather came from the Ukraine, I think in 1904, though I'm not absolutely sure of the date, to the UK, and basically he and many like him just walked in. It was only in 1905 that the first Immigration Act, restricting immigration to the UK, was passed. So that's only 105, 104 years ago. And most European countries were like that. So we're talking about a phenomenon which is a modern phenomenon, and one which is not necessarily positive. There's a whole discourse which you are probably familiar with on whether there should be open borders. Personally, I think open borders are politically unrealistic and probably not desirable in the medium term. But I would invite you to reflect on the fact that we have created a whole system which is being added to after 9/11 and subsequent events of restrictions on migration, whether for tourism or for work, which I think can be very counterproductive. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but I just mentioned the fact that the EU is proposing to introduce a PNR system for travellers, just like the United States has. And I know this is dear to Elspeth's heart, so I'll mention it. This whole range of restrictions creates a great danger for people of all nationalities relating to data protection, but particularly to the stringent rules which we have in Europe on data protection. I sometimes wonder what happens to my fingerprints when I go into the United States. I know that they can have the right to keep them for 7 years in an active file and 8 years in an inactive file. So they must be employing thousands of people to look at people's fingerprints. I don't know, that's their problem. I was told a statistic a few years ago that the Americans had spent $16 billion. This came from an American source, not from a European source. $16 billion in putting in their border system after 9/11. And at that time, this was about 3 years ago, they had caught about, when I say caught, I mean they had apprehended at the border a mere 8,000 people who had infringed the visa restrictions or overstayed their time in the United States. They had caught no terrorists whatsoever. Anti-terrorism is done by intelligence, not by border restrictions. Now, coming more specifically to some of the things that Elspeth said, I think there is, of course, a dichotomy, a contradiction in some of the policies which the EU has put forward. There is, for example, which is this, Elspeth mentioned economic employer sanctions in contrast with the blue card system, but there are several other examples which I could give you. One is carrier liability, responsibility, and the fact that seasonal workers are encouraged, especially in Southern Europe, to come and pick fruit and then go home. So that there are many contradictions in the EU policy, and there are, if you read the latest paper, which I can recommend to you, which is the Stockholm Programme. It was only published on the 16th of October, so probably many of you have not seen it. The Stockholm Programme, An Open and Secure Europe, Serving the Citizen. I can only tell you that most of the things in here are, I think, great disappointment to people in the field, because they're extremely vague and most of them are restrictive. They talk vaguely about encouraging migration to the EU as a positive factor, but in reality, if you look at the detail of this, it's largely concerned with prevention and the expulsion of illegals. So there are great contradictions in the EU strategy as declared in this latest 5-year program, which sounds awfully Soviet to me, but that is the reality. We were working on 5-year cycles. Elspeth mentioned the absorption capacity of the state. That is, of course, a factor. I think that, as I mentioned before, that in limited areas of the EU, there are problems in schools, in social security, and so on. But you have to put that against the obligations, both ethical, moral, and humanitarian obligations, which we have imposed on ourselves and which are the norms which we declare ourselves to be adhering to in Europe. So you have, again, a contradiction, and this field is full of contradictions, between norms and principles and the fact that there can be pressure. Well, I wouldn't like to exaggerate that. Elspeth mentioned the benefits of remittances, and it's certainly true that if you look at remittances, according to World Bank statistics, they are extremely important in terms of replacing aid. And we should in the wealthy countries be very thankful that these people come and send remittances home. The problem with remittances is not the quantity of remittances, that's admirable. The problem is that they, of course, fluctuate according to the economies in the wealthy part of the world. During the recent recession, they've gone down substantially. But especially, what do people do with those remittances when they receive them? I don't know how much research has been done on this, and I'm afraid to tell you that I'm ignorant on that. But I rather suspect that a lot of these remittances are used to provide consumer goods rather than development aid to the country concerned. When I say development aid, of course, I don't mean it literally. I mean development of, for example, starting small businesses or whatever. They're more likely to be used for building houses or buying television sets or mobile phones and such like. That is my impression. If any of you have a contrary opinion, I'd be happy to listen to it. What other comments can I make? I just put in my notes here. Elspeth made a particular point of talking about mobility from the poorer member states of the EU to the wealthier ones. And there's no correlation between poverty and movement. That is probably correct, and I wouldn't contradict her, but I would suggest that that is not the case when it comes to third country nationals. Third country nationals tend to come from poor countries and move to our own wealthier countries. What are the factors that encourage people to come to one place for another? Well, I'm from the UK, so naturally I have a certain knowledge of this. The main reason why people come to the UK and not to Belgium, for example, or to Belgium and not to the UK, is because they have historical connections, or they have family, or they think that they can get a job there more easily, or they speak the language. I mean, all these factors are at play in this particular equation. And even those from the EU don't always get a very good reception when they get to their country, their chosen country. Let's take the Portuguese in Eastern England who work in the poultry industry. They have been historically extremely poorly treated. There is a great hostility to them. Their working conditions are very bad, and it's so much so that there have been complaints by the Portuguese government to the UK government on their behalf. You can also mention the recent incidents in Northern Ireland where Romanian Roma people were more or less hounded out of their homes by the local population. Now, I can't speak for other member states of the EU, but I certainly suspect that even Europeans, as in this case, and certainly non-Europeans, do not receive the reception which they deserve. And the whole debate about integration, which is ongoing in the EU, has a strong relation to that, and is linked back to the point I made about the media. So I think that I've made a number of comments. There are a lot more that I could make, and I'm sure Elspeth has an answer to all of these, so I'll leave you to ask your questions and for her to answer me.
Very good, thank you, Richard. You put your finger on really a number of very pertinent issues, both specific and encapsulating. We now have approximately 30 minutes for comments and questions. I will leave some time for Elspeth to sum up and answer all the questions and solve all the problems at the end. If we survive this. So the floor is open. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you also for this interesting lecture. I had one question concerning the idea of anti-migration strategies, because increasingly what we're seeing now seems to be they're not actually strategies against migrants, but actually migration has become an excuse for EU member states to exchange favors. Recently, this morning, there were 3 Afghani who were expulsed from France through a group flight which was organized by Britain. And one comment which was openly made by a French diplomat was, well, we did that because we wanted to help out the Brits and actually allow them to give a signal to their public opinion that all that money they had put in their e-border system was actually worth it. So I was wondering whether you could talk a bit about these Actually the fact that immigration is just becoming an excuse or a background matter for exchanges of favors between EU governments.
Well, shall we collect a few? Is there any other comments or questions? Well, you can catch up in all these.
I don't know whether I want to move this thing. Maybe we just turn it off.
I couldn't do that either.
No, all right. Well, usually. Oh, God. Yeah, that's better. That's better. I'm sure that's not necessary. I think there's definitely a question about what is the objective of immigration controls, and increasingly as immigration controls become more sophisticated, they seem less and less directed at actually the question of controlling migration. If one looks at the development of technology in terms of immigration controls, the e-border system that the French were saying, oh, well, we want to thank the Brits for putting all that money into e-borders. What is e-borders about? Well, e-borders is this idea that you have your passport is turned into a swipe card, and you swipe yourself in, you swipe yourself out every time you go in and out of the country. Now, in terms of selling this as an idea of immigration control, you can see, oh, this is great. We'll know who's come in and who's gone out. Oh, at least in theory. But is that really what we want to know? And actually, it's not what we want to know. If you're interested in anti-immigration strategies, you're not really interested in how many millions of people come in and go out every year, because they're all the tourists, they're all the business travelers, they're all the people who are coming and going. And keeping track of them is just, it's not useful. What you want to do is you want to know what people are doing when they're there. You want to be able to find them if they are, for instance, overstaying their permission to remain, if they are working in breach of the conditions which are given to them, if they're, what they're doing, or where they are. And this whole e-border thing, it doesn't tell you any about. All it tells you is something about an entry and an exit. And it assumes that your system is capable of doing it, but it doesn't help you to find the individual if you've the state of looking for them. It doesn't help you to know what they're doing while they're there. It does nothing. So then your question is, well, why is it such a popular idea? If it doesn't deal with what we think of as the harms of irregular migration, what are the harms of irregular migration? I'm not going to call it illegal migration, because if you call it illegal migration, that means we're putting it in the category of crime. Put it in the category of crime. That means that there is some illegal activity which is taking place, which is a criminal activity. The problem with overstaying your permission to remain or working when the individual is not permitted to work is that A, the question is, are they crimes? And if they are crimes, do they have victims? No, the victim is the society at large. It's by and large a victimless crime. Who is suffering as a result of this? Unless you turn yourselves into circles about victims of trafficking, you say it's a crime where the individual is the victim of his or her own criminal activity. So the individual, by working in exploitative conditions, is the victim of him or herself. Now, if that's what, those kinds of ills are what you're trying to deal with, working conditions, wages, etc., social benefits, then this e-border system is not particularly interesting because it doesn't do any of that. So what does it do? Well, it provides a tremendous amount of information about individuals who are entering and leaving countries. So it provides all of the information which is on the swipe card, which will give you information about the individual's identity, which is a bit like Richard's problem about the fingerprints. What is happening to those fingerprints? What is interesting is no longer the e-border in terms of keeping track of people coming in and going out, but it's in fact knowing information and storing information about individuals. And I'll use as an example the Australian system, because Australia is one of the only countries in the world which has quite an effective equivalent of e-borders. Because you have to get this online visa before you go, you're logged in when you get there, and you're logged in when you go. So Australia is perhaps the only country that's invested sufficiently in a system like this, that it has all this information about who is there and whether or not they know what somebody's doing, but they know they're overstaying. And of course, if you look at the statistics of the Australian immigration authorities on who overstays their permission to enter Australia, these electronic visas, of course the first category are US nationals and the second category are British nationals. And of course it's exactly what you think if you thought about it. Who goes to Australia and who wants to work on sheep farm? It's our children who are going out in their gap years and having a nice time. It's you, the younger ones of you, who go out and say, I think I'll just kind of hang out a bit longer on the beach in Sydney. I mean, these are the people, and yet the discourse about irregular migration in Australia is all about Afghans, it's about Iranians, it's about Iraqis, it's about people riding little boats, which are absolutely tiny numbers. So what is the value of collecting a bulk of information? Well, the first is it's somewhat embarrassing for Australia's best allies, and so over the last couple of years, what they've done in the statistics is to reframe this, not as illegal immigrants, which they reserve as another category which applies to another bunch of people, but they call, well, there's some delicate euphemism about, what is it? Visa irregularities or something. Anyway, it's exactly the same category, but we've just renamed it, so it's marginally less obvious exactly what the problem is. However, what Australia does have is a tremendous amount of information about people entering and leaving Australia, and their information remains behind. So they leave behind in the Australian statistical database a data double. And what that data double does, and where that data double goes, and what are the technologies. And so the French saying, well, we want to encourage the UK to keep putting money into this, because like, let them send the money, we'll see if it works, and we will get the benefit of this in the longer term. So I think that they're very long-term and complex interactions between questions about migration, issues which begin as questions about migration, and then become transformed into matters of interest for quite different government departments and for quite different sectors of society, but which then result in different capacities, different uses, and infinitely less control by the individual over what is happening with information. And use another example, which is, of course, e-borders won't apply to foreigners, it'll apply to everybody. So you'll finally be able to get all that information about your citizens that you want to. Now, who in the state, which government department, is most interested in knowing whether people leave and enter the state? Well, I can think of two that are tremendously interested. One is benefits agencies. Are you claiming social benefits you're not entitled to because actually you're on holiday somewhere nice? So they want to know who's coming and going with their citizens. And the other is, of course, your tax authorities. Are you actually in the country where you're supposed to be paying taxes and making money when you're supposed to be making money and paying taxes? Or are you somewhere else? And one can see that, leaving aside your intelligence services, which love running profiles through databases, and the more there is, the better it is, and the more their phantasms of risk rise. But it's hard to sustain that, because in the end, in democracies, there's a limit to how much money we're going to give to the intelligence services for that particular set of experiences, unless there's some obvious and immediate threat which we accept as real, which is in front of us. But benefits agencies and tax authorities have infinitely more clout and have much more access to funds to maintain this kind of system, and maybe much more interested in the kind of information which is generated. So while the process which has begun by the immigration authorities on the back of an illegal immigration debate turns into an interest of the police and intelligence communities, as their interest begins to fail to sustain the debate, other ministries, like benefits syntax industries become more interested and see this as a tool which they might find handy for pursuing a whole series of interests they have in tracking their own citizens. And so I think that it's a much more complex debate, with actors moving in and out as the debate moves forward, which is perhaps part of the reason why I think we need to think infinitely more carefully when we kick off these things, on the basis this is going to solve all our problems. And instead of solving our problems, what we've done in terms of the technology is create something which is infinitely more complicated and problematic in the longer term for questions about privacy and individuals.
I told you she was interested in that aspect. The short answer to your question is no. I don't think that the French and the British are particularly interested in exchanging, if you like, favours, put it that way. They are interested in a limited kind of way in helping each other out in local situations. And the best example of that is the infamous camp at Songat, or a more recent version of that, which is, I believe, was called the Jungle, which is was a collection of bidonvilles near Calais, which potential migrants to the United Kingdom gathered in order to try and catch a ferry or hop on the train going through the Channel Tunnel. I think the French capacity for helping the British over Songat was actually quite limited, and they were really pushed in order to do something about it. Incidentally, my own view, for what it's worth, on that particular issue is that it doesn't matter actually whether you have Songat or the jungle or you don't have any of these places. If you get rid of Songat, you get rid of the jungle, then you just push the problem back further from the border. Because migrants will come whether you like it or not. You have to deal with them. And it's much better to deal with them in humanitarian conditions than it is to have them living in open fields in the middle of winter. That is my personal opinion. If you push it back from Songat, they'll end up in Arras, and if you push it back from Arras, they'll end up in Lyon, eventually. The capacity of the EU member states to cooperate on immigration is actually quite limited. I mean, you only have to look at the discourse and the council debates, which I actually took part in the 2000s, on economic migration, to realise that there is no will for an economic migration policy. The Commission is really looking around the edges of this in order to create coordination and things like that. I haven't seen any real progress on a coherent economic integration policy for the last 10 years in the EU. And so when you ask me, are the EU member states exchanging favours, my short answer is no.
Actually, I would like to react on this last point. I think that there is cooperation, and the cooperation to do not take responsibility. So
the cooperation is not what?
The corporation to do not take responsibility. So, in some point, I agree with the comment made here, because France is doing what England is doing, and what on local level is happening, or EU level. Because we cannot say that nothing is happening, because something is happening. Today, illegal migration. Professor Gilt uses irregular migration. I can appreciate that fact, but EU uses illegal migration is the biggest challenge in Europe today. So there is something happening. But I was interested in one point you made at the beginning on cities. You mentioned Rotterdam, Bradford, but you didn't mention Brussels. I was surprised from that. Could you explain a little bit more what you meant with this point?
Well, that was me who made that point, and you're quite right. I could have easily mentioned Brussels, especially since I've been involved in some work on this. What I meant simply was that there are certain relatively limited number of places where there are very high concentrations of immigrants. And that this can, I don't say it always does, but this can cause social dislocation, especially in places like schools, where language issues are very acute in young children. That's what I meant.
And
Brussels is as good an example as Radboud or Rotterdam.
and what has migration has to do with this?
What does migration to do with it? Well,
Yeah, because you were speaking also about ethical commitments and norms and principles, but isn't it just a responsibility that the state should take to provide better education, equal chances in these schools or...
the state does not have a duty to provide better education for immigrants. It has a duty to provide education for everybody who's living on the territory of the state.
Yeah, exactly.
And hopefully that education will be of a sufficient standard to allow people to live productive lives. I mean, that's the only thing that one can say about education.
So why there is a problem with schools, for example, in communes like Molenbeek?
The reason why there's a problem in schools, not just in Molenbeek, but in let's say parts of Rotterdam, which I've had experience of, is because children arrive in those schools not speaking the national language. And of course, the schools would normally teach the national language. Now, in some compounded in Brussels by the fact that you have two national languages operating. In Rotterdam, they have taken interesting steps to try and deal with that. In Canada, they've also done that, by the way, and that is to bring in teachers whose native language is the native language of the immigrant children. And they teach them in that language and introduce them to the national language over a short period of time. The children pick up languages very quickly, so it doesn't really take time. And then they start to move over to the national language. So there's a transition period for children entering the school system. The problem is, and I don't know if you've seen this, there's a film which was brought out roughly a year ago called Entre les Murs, which was, you've probably seen that.
Yeah.
And there you have a good illustration, I think a fair illustration, of what can happen where, for example, the family language is not the national language. It becomes an issue, and not least for the school administration.
Yeah, but I don't think that's the main issue, because we see the difference in French-speaking schools or Dutch-speaking schools in Brussels. So we see also a big difference, let us say, with immigrants going to school in rich communes in Brussels or in poor communes in Brussels. And as you know, the case of Brussels, I think you should also know that the schools, the situation of the schools, the money that these schools get, the teachers who want to teach in the schools in areas like Molenbeek, Anderlecht, Schaerbeek, Kuregem, you know, that's a big problem. So when I say that the state should take the responsibility, I think they don't need to bring teachers that use their own language, but just provide better schools maybe for these people.
And then you're talking about, I don't want to dwell on this because I want other people to be able to ask questions, but I mean, you're talking about the general standard of education in these schools rather than the issue of immigrants in the schools. I think that's a slightly different issue.
I want to come in on this for a couple of reasons. And the first is that the European Commission has now set as an objective for all of us that we should speak 3 languages fluently. And we should be able to write in 2 languages fluently. And so it seems to me that every time we talk about it's such a disadvantage to have one language spoken at home and one language spoken outside the home. It seems to me that must be divine, because those children, at least when they speak 2 languages, and then their chances of picking up a 3rd one are probably better than, where you have everybody speaking the same language all the time, in which case, like in the UK, where nobody ever learns a second language, and it's let alone, and they can't even write in English, let alone in any other language. So I think that we get caught up on this. Social exclusion is the issue. Why are there crappy schools in poor neighborhoods? Well, there you are. The question answers itself. It's about social exclusions and the mechanisms of social exclusions. How do we reproduce our social order? Well, it's because we give middle-class students good educations and children of poor families, poor educations. And then it will be only the middle-class students that will succeed at university, and we will have recreated the social order which existed before. So, of course, we have a whole series of programs and projects to try and transform that. When we say this is not a good social order, there should be equal opportunity, we should not have social reproduction on this kind of level, there should be an entitlement according to ability, we have all the discourse. But it isn't about foreigners, it's about the problem of social exclusion. exclusion, what you do about social exclusion.
Yeah, exactly. This is my point, because mostly we get stuck, and we are still stuck in this. It's a matter of culture, it's a matter of language, it's a matter of religion, Islam, mostly Muslims. But I fully agree that it's a matter of social exclusion.
But it's a bit like what I was talking about earlier. We have this commonsensical acceptance of the, we want to see everything but what is true. We want to see every single excuse except using common sense as the argument, rather than taking a proper approach to the creation of knowledge and understanding, using the tools which we have developed in academia. Say, what is the problem here? The problem here is the obvious social exclusion. You can look at any of Eurostat statistics and you see what the problem is. And yet, there's an insistence, no, it's not social exclusion which is the problem, it's the problem that, and then you can just name them off. And they change with generations. So the arguments today are, they speak the wrong language, they have the wrong religion, or whatever. But if you went back 50 years, here in Brussels, it would be completely different languages and different religions you'd be talking about. We picking on the same criteria. But I wanted to go back to this issue about illegal immigration as a major concern, because this is another one of my great interests. I just heard of a Mori poll, which was carried out in the United Kingdom, and they discovered that among people who considered that immigration and illegal immigration was a big problem, the majority of them read newspapers. And the majority of people who never read newspapers didn't think that immigration was a problem at all. So we have definitely a question about what is the reproduction of insecurity via the media. And I think this is also reflected in the European Commission's documents about how many illegal immigrants are there in Europe at any given time. Right? This is the question that policymakers ask everything. And so there are a whole series of researchers trying to figure out how many illegal immigrants there are in any particular day in the European Union. And of course it's a terribly, terribly unsatisfactory thing to be trying to do. Because as you know, if there are any foreign students in the room, if you might only have another week to go and you'll get your degree, and your residence permit runs out the week before. No, the hell with it. I'll just stay the week, get my degree, and leave. I'm not going to go through all that hassle again. Nothing's going to happen. And so there's somebody who's an illegal immigrant one day and is gone the next day. So you have a temporality which makes it all terribly difficult to anticipate. But you have assessments from, there's one particular set of researchers who suggest that there are 2.5 million irregular migrants in the European Union at any given time, given taking into account how quickly they move. You have Europol, which for reasons best known to itself, with no competence over irregularity, suddenly pulled out of the pot a figure between 6 and 8 million irregular migrants at any given time. Now they don't have any particular authority, and it's never been clear why they came up with that. If you go to the agency with responsibility for border controls, which is Frontex, and if you read their annual report 2008, they state that 300,000 persons were treated as illegal immigrants in the member states in 2008. Okay, now we know. The member states found 300,000. Well, that doesn't mean how many are there, but that means how many were treated as illegal immigrants. If you then go to the statistics of Serafi, which is a data consolidating little unit up in the council, they keep statistics on the nationalities of persons who have been treated as illegal immigrants in the member states. And the last set of statistics which I saw, because they're confidential and therefore one doesn't get access to them very often, were for 2006, and published in 2008. And there they indicated that by far over 50% of the people who were treated as illegal immigrants in the member states in 2006 were Romanians by nationality. So the answer to that question was, if you want to deal with illegal immigrants, make their state a member state of the European Union. On the 1st of January 2007, they were no longer illegal immigrants, so there was no longer any problem. The question of whether this is a major concern, what kind of a concern it is, how it should be addressed, lead to the most disparate kinds of responses. And the most extraordinarily unlikely kinds of responses, when one tries to deal with what is the knowledge we actually have about the European Union and about third country nationals in the European Union. Okay, I have my hand.
First, a small comment to go along with these wrong ideas we have. When I was doing research on undocumented migration, irregular migration in 2000, most orders to leave the country, I don't know how you say that in English, but in Belgium, translation of the Belgian document, were given to French citizens. It's really weird. I never went through to see how that comes and how this, but that were the statistics of the Foreign Office. And then another question is, what is your idea about the idea that the most coherent economic policy in Europe is the tolerance, the policy of tolerance, and there the best term is the Dutch term, gedoogbeleid, concerning drugs, is the policy of tolerance of undocumented migrants, creating an easy workforce, not too demanding. Probably it's not the most manifest and the most stated official European policy, but it is considered in 2000 by Radboud and Elspeth, it was considered also as the most realistic political solution to this problem. Let's just tolerate people who are on our territory. And it's the only way to resolve an intractable policy problem.
If you can make your question in 30 seconds, then...
Oh, I do hope I can. It relates to the comment by Mr. Lewis on the construct of borders that has been quite recent. And I was wondering, like in the discourse that we have, it's normally opposing the rights of the state to maintain a border and the right of a person to choose the country of their residence. And I was just thinking that it's kind of that the idea that a state has a right to control the borders kind of is based more and more on the idea that social contributions must be paid for those who are within the walls of the state. And that kind of links to Ms. Gill's points on the weight of migrants within the social state and as a kind of burden. And yeah, I was just wondering if kind of on the European level we're moving towards maintaining the internal borders or just outsourcing them, and how that links to kind of a European social, not system, but a social, say, construct within Europe, or if we're just putting everything towards the outside borders of Europe. I don't know if you can comment on that.
I'll do a very quick response. The first is on tolerance. I think we need to go a lot further than tolerance. I think we need to be thinking about a rights-based approach, and we need to think about people having secure resident statuses. We need to be thinking about a much more realistic migration policies that actually reflect the realities on the ground and exclude the capacity of employers to use irregular status or even tolerance as a mechanism to pay lower wages or have substandard working conditions. So I think we need to go further than that. It's a good starting place as opposed to this business of criminalizing employers, but it's, I don't think it's enough. I agree with you. I think there's a fascinating move taking place. Sovereignty seems to have left the state borders, and it's moved into social security, and it's moved into defense. And so we see this, the state hanging on to its social security for dear life and saying, this is where our sovereignty lies, in our benefits offices. And I think that's a very, very interesting development, and one which deserves more analysis. Of course, anyone who looks at the statistics knows that migrants, by and large, pay a lot more into a social security system than they get out. And that's why they can figure that almost 40% of the social benefits budgets of the member states go to old age benefits, and most migrants leave. So they don't get those benefits unless there is an export of retirement benefit agreement between their country of origin and EU states. And most EU states, like the Netherlands, doesn't like to have agreements with poor countries to export those benefits. But I think it's a very interesting move about where is sovereignty. When sovereignty is on the move, where does it go? And I think for the moment, there's a very interesting movement out there. I'm very, very sorry. I think I'm going to leave.
Yes, Professor Gill has to jump in a taxi, or she's going to be sleeping on my sofa.
Yes.
Here is the book, Security Migration in the 21st Century. Next week, the Director of Amnesty Europe, Nicholas Baker, will be speaking, and see you then.